Today we're sewing up a feminine flowy dress that would make a great option for an upcoming party or holiday event. This is Simplicity 9678. There are a few variations offered for this pattern. I'm sewing View B today. The fabric that I've chosen for this project is an Oxford blue design printed on polyester satin by realfabric.com. Realfabric.com allows you to choose any design that you're interested in and have it printed on the fabric of your choice. Come and join me as I sew this dress today from start to finish. Let's get started. Before I attach my back bodice pieces, I'm going to finish those center back edges for both pieces separately. Now that those edges are finished, I'll place these back pieces right sides together, and I'll start pinning them from the large dot transferred from the pattern piece. And then continue pinning from the large dot to the bottom of the back bodice. Now I'll sew these pieces together from the large dot, back stitching to secure, with a 5/8 inch seam allowance to the bottom of the back bodice. And then I'll press that 5/8 inch seam allowance open from top to bottom. I've gone ahead and finished the side seams of the back bodice separately on both sides. And I've done the same for my front bodice piece. Now I'll place these front and back bodice pieces right sides together and pin the side seams. Sew both side seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press your seams open. To prepare to hem the bottom of my sleeve at a later step, I'm going to take it to the ironing board and press the bottom raw edge of the sleeve to the wrong side all the way across by 1/2 inch. Doing this for the bottoms of both sleeves. And then with those memory creases folded out for now, I've gone ahead and finished both short side seams for both sleeves. Now I'm going to place this sleeve right sides together and pin the underarm seam. Doing this for both sleeves. And then sew these underarm seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press the seams open. Now we can use those pre-pressed creases to create a narrow hem at the bottom of the sleeves, folding the raw edge to the crease, and then on the crease, and pinning all the way around. Then take it to your sewing machine and edge stitch close to that inner fold all the way around the bottom of the sleeve, doing this for both sleeves. Now I'll place the sleeve right sides together with its armhole, matching the underarm seams and the notches, and pin in place. And then doing this on the other side to place the opposite sleeve in the opposite armhole. Then sew those sleeves in place with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, serge your seams together, and press them toward the sleeve. Now using the longest stitch on your machine and about a 1/2 inch seam allowance, we're going to sew basting stitches all around the top edge of the garment, all the way around. Start your basting stitches 5/8 inch away from the finished edge of the back piece, basting all around the upper edge, and then stopping your stitches 5/8 inch away from the edge on the opposite side, remembering to leave thread tails on both sides so that you have threads to pull for gathering. Apply interfacing to the wrong sides of your front and back facing pieces, and then place these pieces right sides together, matching your notches. And pin in place. Sew both notched ends with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press your seams open. To finish my outer edges, first I'm going to take it to my serger and serge from one back edge all the way around to the opposite back edge. Then I'll press those finished edges to the wrong side of the facing all the way around by about 1/4 inch. Then I'll take it to my sewing machine and top stitch those finished edges all the way around, once again from one corner back all the way around to the opposite corner back. Now I'm going to start pulling the gathering stitches at the top of the back pieces. And once that's gathered, we can start attaching the facing to the top edges. Match the center front of your facing with the center front of your bodice, and match the seams of your facing with the front seams of your armholes. And pin in place. Then match the small dots that you transferred to your facing to the back armhole seams, and also match up the vertical back edges. Make sure your gathers are distributed evenly and go ahead and finish pinning in place. Then we can sew the facing to the neckline all the way around, as well as sewing the facing to the back edge from the top up to as far as the finished edge of the facing. Doing that on both sides and sewing all of these portions with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Now we can trim our back corners, as well as trimming the seam allowances all the way around. Also use sharp scissors to clip into the curves of the neckline, clipping close to but not through your stitching line. Then we're going to understitch the facing. We're going to turn the facing over its seam allowance. Then we're going to sew the facing to its seam allowance, edge stitching close to that seam line. And as you're understitching, your presser foot won't allow you to sew all the way to those back corners, so just understitch as far as you can and backstitch to secure, doing this at both back edges. Now we can turn the facing to the inside of the garment, poking out those corners. And then give those neckline edges a good press. And then using a needle and thread, you can hand tack your facing to each of the seam allowances at the front and back sleeves, just sewing the bottom edge of the facing to that seam allowance a few times. Doing that at each seam. Now for the center back edges, when we turn the facing to the inside of the garment, those center back seam allowances should fold nicely into place, especially as we've already pre-pressed that seam. Now I'm going to take it to my sewing machine and top stitch those back opening edges, sewing from the very top of the garment to the opening of the slit, pivoting and continuing to top stitch all the way back up until I'm at the top of the opposite center back. Then to create a closure here at the top center back, you can use a needle and thread to sew a hook and eye to the inside top edges. Place your midriff pieces right sides together, matching your notches, and pin the side seams. Also pin together the center backs. Then sew each of those 3 seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Press each seam allowance open and finish the raw edges. Before I attach the midriff to the bottom of the bodice, I'm going to finish the raw edges of the bottom of the bodice all the way around. Now that those bottom bodice edges are finished, I'll place my midriff right sides together with the bottom of the bodice all the way around, matching my center front and backs, the notches and the side seams, and pinning all the way around. And then sew the midriff to the bottom of the bodice all the way around with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Then we're going to trim those raw edges of the midriff seam allowance to about 1/4 inch all the way around, making sure to only trim the side of the seam allowance that belongs to the midriff, as we're not going to be trimming those finished edges of the bodice. And then open out that midriff and press those seam allowances down toward the midriff. Now place your front and back yoke pieces right sides together, matching the side seams, and pin in place. Also pin the center back seam. Then just as we did for the midriff, we're going to sew each of these seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, press the seams open, and finish both sides of the seam separately. Now before I attach this yoke to the midriff, I'm going to finish the top raw edges of the yoke all the way around. Now we can pin the upper edge of the yoke to the bottom of the midriff, matching your center fronts, center backs, your notches, and your side seams, and pin in place all the way around. And then sew the yoke to the midriff all the way around with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, just as we did to attach the bodice to the midriff earlier. Now that yoke is attached to the midriff, we're going to trim that midriff side of the seam allowance just as we did earlier, trimming that raw edge to about 1/4 inch, and once again leaving the finished yoke side of the seam allowance intact. And then open out the yoke and press this new seam allowance up toward the midriff all the way around. Now to form our casings, we're going to sew 1/4 inch away from the finished edges along both of the seam allowances that we've pressed toward the midriff. Sew 1/4 inch away from both finished edges through all thicknesses, and then leave a gap in your stitching of about 1 to 2 inches for each casing so that we can insert our elastics. Cut 2 pieces of 1/4 inch wide elastic to match the length of your elastic guide pattern piece, and then attach a safety pin to one short end of the elastic and lace it through your casing in the opening that you left in your stitches. Once you have the elastic laced through the casing, overlap the loose ends and stitch back and forth to secure. And then sew closed that gap in your stitching following the original stitching line. Repeat all of these steps to insert your elastic into the remaining casing. Place 2 of the 3 front and back skirt pieces right sides together. Sew this seam with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and finish your seam. Then open out this seam and place your 3rd front and back skirt panel right sides together with one of the raw edges of the connected pieces. And pin in place. And then sew this new seam with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and finish the seam. Then place the 2 remaining loose raw edges of your skirt panels right sides together, pin in place, sew together with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, and then finish your edges. Here is the very bottom edge of my skirt piece. It's going to be easier to hem the skirt now before it's attached to the main dress. I've gone ahead and used my serger to finish the edges all around the bottom of the skirt. I'm choosing to just fold up this finished edge to the wrong side by 5/8 inch and press all the way around. Now I'll take this pressed bottom edge to the sewing machine and edge stitch close to those finishing stitches all the way around the bottom of the skirt. Now for the top raw edge of the skirt, we're going to sew 3 sets of basting stitches. 1 set of basting stitches for each panel. Leave thread tails at the beginning of your stitches, and sewing with about a 1/2 inch seam allowance, we're going to start at one seam and sew all the way across until we get to the next seam. Then we're going to leave thread tails and then start a fresh set of stitches on the other side of that same seam, once again leaving thread tails and continuing straight across until you get to the next seam and break your stitches and continue to the next seam. Now we can start attaching the top gathered edge of the skirt with the bottom of the yoke. Place one of your skirt seams at your center back and pin in place. Then place the remaining skirt seams with the dots at the bottom of your yoke. Then start pulling the gathering stitches so that the skirt fits the yoke from point to point. Once they fit together and the gathers are distributed evenly, go ahead and pin in place. And then gather the 2 remaining skirt panels to fit the bottom of the yoke from point to point. Once we have that skirt pinned to the yoke all the way around, we can stitch it in place with a 5/8 inch seam allowance all the way around, finish those raw edges, and then press the seam up toward the yoke. And now your dress is complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. Check out the rest of my video library for more great sewing inspiration, and I'll see you in the next video.